Good morning, afternoon, or evening, wherever and whenever you are. My name is Benjamin.
My name is Caleb.
And we're making a game called Monster Pack together.
We are building Monster Pack, which is simultaneously a game and a challenge. The game part is that it's a monster training RPG without the slow-paced grind of traditional RPGs. And the challenge part is to build a game in 2 months.
Yeah, and as part of that challenge, we've set up a calendar. And that calendar is something that you guys have been asking about. We started off with some base kind of boards to use. We have a doing, a done, and then a board for each category, like music, sound, programming, art.
Marketing.
Yep. Those things. And so then for each category, we add specific tasks that are bigger tasks. So it'll be like battle system, for example. And then inside of that task, we add subtasks. So the battle system would have a turn system, monsters that deal damage using stats. So there's little subtasks inside of that. And then we give those some sort of a due date so we can stick them on our calendar. We've scoped it out pretty small. Because of that small scope, we're able to do pretty well. In fact, we started out ahead, right? We're not really ahead anymore. I wouldn't say we're behind yet, but we're definitely close. We're like on the line there.
Yeah, we've been playing catch up a little bit.
Yeah, we've been playing catch up a little bit.
People don't realize the underlying complexity of games. Like, there are a lot of different elements inside of a video game. Like, they're a monster. They're very complicated, and you only realize how complicated things are once you start trying to actually put it together for yourself.
A general topic for this video is how our game is different from the Pokemon games, right? And one of the things that we ran into was how different the Pokemon battle system is than what we currently had implemented. And we're far enough into development that we're kind of committed to the system that we've implemented. In Pokemon, you have a turn. Well, let's call it like a pre-turn. It's not necessarily a turn. You have a pre-turn where both trainers, or, if it's a wild Pokemon, they get to choose what action they want to do in this pre-turn. And then once those actions are selected, you have the actual turns that happen. And the turns take place based on the speed stat. Whichever monster gets priority gets to attack, and the other one then retaliates, and then it goes back to kind of the pre-turn again, where they're selecting the moves to use. Our game doesn't do it like that. What happens is you choose a move, and then that move is executed. The enemy monster or trainer chooses a move, and then their move is executed. And so it's always one side, then the other side, then one side, then the other side. It alternates like that every time. And when we realized that we had a problem, right?
Yeah.
And the problem was, how are we going to... We'd made a speed stat, but it was useless. There was no use for the speed stat. So we started to talk and try to come up with a way to use the speed stat. And we came up with a speed system, right? And there are two kinds. There's a fast monster and a slow monster. And so instead of having a stat like a number, we just have fast and slow.
Every turn, you generate 1 energy or 2 energy. And if you're a fast monster, you generate 2 energy. And if you're a slow monster, then you generate 1. The actions of the monsters cost different amounts of energy. And so a fast monster can use higher cost energy moves over a long period of time more than a slow monster because it just generates twice as much. And balancing that, I think, should be interesting. Kind of what I think we're going for here is, in fighting games, there are certain archetypes for fighters. For example, in Super Smash Bros., there's grapplers and zoners. And a grappler would be like Bowser or Donkey Kong, and a zoner would be like Marth, Lucina, any characters that have big range moves. And the fast and slow in our game can kind of be like archetypes for the monsters. Like, you might have a slow monster that has a lot of defense, or a fast monster that's more of a glass cannon. And I think that's kind of what will naturally emerge game design wise out of this speed stat is kind of like different archetypes of monsters, and that should be kind of interesting.
Yeah, it'll make it more interesting when designing the monsters, and I think that's going to be fun, you know? Mm-hmm. Design is one of the funnest parts of game development. As we get these different monsters that we create the artwork for, it will be fun to try and design their stats in a way that fits the artwork and fits some sort of archetype. We might even come up with some of our own archetype names for the monsters and kind of use those as a base when we're creating new monsters.
And so to sum it up, because we realized our turn system was different from the turn system found in the Pokemon games, that is what ultimately caused us to change the speed stat.
With turn-based games, one of the things you really want to focus on is making sure that the turns are different every single turn. Like the player has a good reason to use different moves instead of the same move over and over, right? That's where the strategy comes in. We used our energy system as a way to help encourage them to use different actions. And another thing that we're going to be using to help encourage them to use different actions is the status effects. Now our game's small, so we're currently only planning for 3 status effects, but I think the ones that we have will help with the direction we want to take the game in and make interesting turns.
Mm-hmm. So the status effects kind of diversify the move sets of each of the monsters in a way that encourages the player to use different actions at different times during a battle. And so the 3 status effects we have are bleeding, stunned, and exhausted. Bleeding is similar to poison. It's just incremental damage every single turn. Mm-hmm. Stunned prevents your monster from moving that turn.
For one turn.
And exhausted prevents your monster from gaining an energy.
Yeah, one turn. Gaining any energy.
Any energy.
So if they're a fast monster, then they won't gain 1, because fast ones normally gain 2. But they'll just gain 0, and a slow monster will also gain 0. So you just don't gain energy that turn.
So it's kind of similar to stunned, but it has different consequences, and it's not quite as powerful, because if your monster had energy when it was exhausted, you would still be able to use an action.
You'll be able to switch it out. Some actions also cost 0 energy, so you could use... Even if you're exhausted, you could use an action that doesn't cost any energy, whether it's a stat buff, action, or debuff on another monster, something like that. And then exhaust is also quite useless if they have full energy. So like if you exhaust the enemy and they have their energy is maxed out that turn, they weren't going to gain energy anyways at the start of their turn, right? And so there are certain times where it's not as useful. Stun is definitely a lot more powerful, and we'll be balancing the actions accordingly. Stun will have some interesting effects too, but I think exhaust will be more nuanced.
It will make the player's decision making a little bit more difficult. In a turn-based game, you never want the player to feel like they know exactly what they should do every single time.
Yeah, you want to, that's where the choices come. So you want those choices to be interesting choices. Mm-hmm. On their turn, what choice do they make? And you want that to be interesting and not obvious. If it's obvious, then it's not well designed. On top of that, we're going to be doing stat buffs and debuffs. We haven't figured out exactly how a lot of those are going to go, actually.
I assume they'll be with the attack and the defense stat.
Yeah, because we can't do speed. Although I guess we could technically do speed. That would be interesting.
It might get kind of crazy.
Well, you could only let them get a speed buff, once, or a debuff once. You could basically move them between fast and slow. Like if they're slow, then you could speed them up, and if they're fast, you could slow them down. That could be interesting. When do the stats leave? That's a question that we haven't really answered, right? And in the Pokemon games, if you swap out your Pokemon for another one, then the stats are reset when you switch during battle. But we can't do that because we have instant switching, right? And so we have to kind of figure out how that's going to work in battle. And that's going to be one of the places where it's different from Pokemon, because we have instant switching in. You can switch at any time without any cost. And so we have to make sure that that doesn't reset your stats. So you could just, if you get a debuff, you could just switch and then switch back to get rid of the debuff.
Buffs and debuffs will add again a little bit more nuance to the decision making with individual actions, but it'll also add a little bit of macro level decision during the battle, like it does in Pokemon. Because in Pokemon, you know, there's the strategy of team sweeping, where you basically just buff and buff and buff your Pokemon till it's as strong as it can get, and then you can sweep their entire team. And that's kind of a macro level strategy, because you're thinking several turns ahead with that. You're thinking, okay, I can't kill them now, and I'm going to take some damage now, but it will be strong enough that I'll just be able to sweep the rest of their team by turn 5 or whatever.
Yeah, we probably won't want it to be quite as, I guess, polarizing as Pokemon, where you have sweeping is kind of an uninteresting strategy, to be honest, because you don't switch out to different monsters. You just kind of buff the one and then wipe them out. And so, you know, Pokemon has stat stacking, so you can apply an attack buff multiple times. They limited it as well.
Yeah.
We'll probably want to limit stat buffs as well. I'd be inclined to limit it to 1 or 2 and not have like greatly increasing it like Pokemon does. But we'll see. That'll be balancing again as well, and we'll kind of have to figure that out.
In Monster Pack, our attacks don't have an accuracy check, and what that means is we're not going to have like a randomness of whether or not you hit the opposing monster.
So every attack is going to be guaranteed. I would say that accuracy checks are a little bit controversial in Pokemon, especially the competitive scene, because it's annoying, right? When you use a move that's 95 accuracy or whatever and you miss. I mean, look at XCOM too. People really hate it in XCOM. Yeah, it kind of leads into the random input versus random output discussion. I don't remember who coined those terms exactly, but it's a very popular thing to talk about in game development. Pokemon has that random output where you choose your move and then randomly it can miss based on the accuracy check. And we want to remove that from our game, where you just don't miss. If you use a move, you're going to hit. And we balance the moves using the energy instead of an accuracy check, right? Using energy cost.
And so the player never has to really worry about, what if it misses, you know? And so if they have a sound strategy, you know, that's logical, then it's going to work. They don't have to worry about any output randomness that's going to ruin their plan.
However, you do lose something with that. And there is some benefit to having output randomness. And because of that, we decided to come up with our own system for critical attacks. So in Pokemon, you have critical attacks. There's a whatever chance that a move will get a critical, and I think it does 1.5 damage if you get a crit. And so you deal a lot of extra damage if you get a critical attack. And that feels really good, right? When you do get a critical, it's like, yes, that's awesome. It sucks though when the opponent gets a critical on you. What we're going to do is have a system that is biased towards the player, and there will be 2 kinds of criticals essentially. One is where you get a critical, your monster gets a critical on the enemy monster, and there's going to be a critical, I would say, resist, which is where the enemy monster hits you and you resist the damage that they deal. So when you get a critical, you'll deal 1.5 extra, and if you get a resist against their attack, then their attack will deal half damage.
What we're doing here is we're solving the problems that come with unbiased output randomness. Unbiased output randomness is where both teams could randomly get a critical hit. And that would be bad in Monster Pack, because the consequences for a critical hit are pretty hefty. You could lose one of your monsters and never be able to get it back because it's dead now.
Yeah.
Unbiased output randomness has this problem where even though it's technically fair, it doesn't feel good. More often than not, it makes them frustrated. And so biased output randomness is a good way to resolve that issue, because it's like a happy accident whenever it happens. It's like maybe your plan wasn't going quite the way you thought it was going, and you're worried that one of your monsters was going to die, and it gets hit by an action from the opposing monster and ends up surviving because of the anti-critical hit, or whatever we were calling it.
Yeah, the resist.
The resist. And that feels good to the player.
And it's similar to, if you think about Into the Breach. In Into the Breach, the enemies are attacking the buildings. There's a grid power, and every time a building takes damage, you lose that grid power. If you lose all of it, you lose the game, right? That's the failure spectrum in Into the Breach. But there's a chance that the building will resist damage. And so it's biased in the player's favor. There's never a chance that the enemy will deal more damage. There's just always a chance that the building can completely resist damage. And we're going for that with these as well. And we'll explain it with something like saying, you know, your monster tried harder for you, or something like that. Where it's like, then when they die, the player feels real bad about it, you know?
Yeah.
We made a lot of progress this week. I'm excited. Made a lot of progress on our calendar. We've got...
The calendar... particularly, we made a lot of progress on.
Yeah, the calendar. We've got a lot of stuff to show you, and I'm excited to get it to the point where we can start doing testing. Once again, if you guys are interested in this, we'll leave a link down below to where you can sign up for the alpha and beta testing that we're going to be doing. I don't know how close we are. We're three weeks into this 2-month challenge, so we're getting close to that. But if you enjoyed this video, give it a like, thumbs up, and subscribe, and we'll see you all again next week.